Welcome back. Day two at the Capital Markets Conference. We are being hosted in this wonderful bar called the Hare and Hound here at Troutbeck Inn. And I have the honor and privilege of hosting two senior investment executives at our sovereign wealth fund, the Mutapa Investment Fund, Ernst and Simba. And we're just going to have a discourse about the fund, its potential, some of the perceptions out there in the market about the fund, about what it does do and what it can achieve. So let's just get the negatives out of the way first.
I didn't realize there were negatives. I thought it was all positives.
Because I prefer to end on a positive, upbeat note. So so if we listen to the critics. Yeah. Right? They'll say, when the minister talked about a lot of these state-owned enterprises, right, in the early days of the Second Republic, the idea was to actually privatize them, to offload them. And many people actually thought that some of them, as businesses, were dogs and ought to actually just be liquidated, not even disposed of, right? So here we have this collection of these businesses that for the last 10, 15, 20 years have been bleeding the fiscus, right? Negative cash flows. And they've all been put into this animal called Mutapa. And they're disparate businesses, right? They couldn't be more different, right? This is like you have an airline business. You have a business that slaughters cattle in CSC. You have a telco in Tel1, Telesar, and Net1. You have Kuimba Mining House, which is, so when all of this was put together, some of the criticism is a lot of the businesses are dogs and should just be liquidated. And the other criticism was, how can any one executive office actually understand these very different businesses with very different that operate in very different sectors, that have very different history. Some of them are doing relatively well. Some of them have been failing for 15, 20 years. How can any one management team manage this colossus? Because it is a colossus. It's huge.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Probably, in fact, not probably, in terms of just asset base, the biggest single institution of privately held businesses in our country.
Agreed. Yes.
So I don't know which one of you is excited by this question. Who wants to take the first bite?
Do you want to take that, Ernest? I saw you really
thinking
about it. Yeah. He twitched. He twitched.
I don't know if it's twitching, but I guess, look, I think a sovereign wealth fund was needed in Zim. In my own account, I think it's something that was overdue. And I think pretty much a lot of it is around what you've actually just said, in terms of when you look back into why these state-owned enterprises were formed back in time and what the structures were. The question is then, are the structures still fit for purpose for them to compete? Because at the time they were formed, we can pretty much say industrialization or private sector companies were still in sort of the formative stages. Okay? Then fast forward to where we are now, where a lot of them have competitors. You look at where Econet started and where it is today.
It's a phenomenal business.
You could make the argument that all it did was cannibalize the bureaucracy around PTC at the time, in terms of it had the fixed line infrastructure and wasn't nimble enough to go into data and fiber. Private sector saw that gap. They could raise money without procurement bottlenecks, and now they're the biggest mobile and data operator in the country. And you also look at it from back in time to say these entities actually used to contribute a significant percentage to fiscal revenues. Now they're bleeding. So
they're negative.
How do you turn that around? Either you maintain the status quo, or you actually look for a change. So we've looked into, call it best practice, or what certain nations who've been bestowed with, whether it's oil and gas, mineral wealth, what they've done in terms of certain finite resources or endowments to turn them
like
into
Norway, Saudi Arabia,
yeah, I mean, you look at Emirates and people forget it's actually
oil money.
oil money,
correct.
right? Who owns Emirates Airlines?
Yeah, yeah.
Right? You don't look at it as a state-owned entity. You look at it on its own commercial attractiveness.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what Mutapa seeks to do. Now, the question around should a few executives be running this colossus or whatever, I think is a bit of a misunderstanding of something starts somewhere. And its formative stages. It's in infancy, tongue twister. But I think what we intend to do is get the right skill sets, because we do think Zim is a talented country. She's got very smart young kids all over the world who, if given a chance and given the wings to fly, they can come in and take these things to great
To the next
heights.
level, for sure.
Yeah.
100%.
So I don't know if I've answered your full question,
Yeah.
but I do think we've got the
yeah,
capability
you
to
took, you
make
took
this
a big
work.
bite.
Yeah. Look, I want to add to what Ernest has said, which I think he's kind of articulated brilliantly some of the ways that we want to look at it. But I want to also just go back slightly to deal with some of the historical concerns. So the first thing, you mentioned something around the fact that the state-owned enterprises, there was a strategy, or at least some murmurings around privatizing most of them.
Yes,
and I
100%.
think that's quite key for us to address as well. So the main reason that we have not gone ahead to just privatize those entities is because of the poor performance of those entities. It meant that if we tried to privatize them, in most cases, we were going to get very little value for the businesses. So part of Mutapa's mandate is to assist in the turnaround of those businesses. Then if we decide we actually want to sell some of those shares, we're getting good value for that business. And we experimented. We had an experiment of this with Kuvimba Mining House, which, as you know, was started off with mines that were nearly defunct or not functioning. And by the time we got to where we are today, the value had significantly increased, and the asking price, or in fact, when we now get people asking about Kuvimba and our mines, we can sit around the table and speak as equals, because now they want to pay the actual value for them. But at the start, when a company is under care and maintenance, we're almost desperate to give it away because it's costing us and not giving us anything back.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting philosophical question for me, which I hope you'll indulge, which is, and this is not Mutapa specific, this is just globally when we're talking about companies that are failing and turning them around, right? There's an argument that sometimes actually the best way to turn around a company is to force it to go through bankruptcy or liquidation. Yeah. Right?
Yes.
So, because firstly it's fast, right? And the creditors just have to be very realistic and grounded.
Correct.
And the kind of investor that then gets in, right, on the other side, picking up assets, is very focused, very clear that they're getting the asset minus any legacy issues.
Yes.
Right? Now, if you try to turn around a business as a failing going concern, you don't have all those benefits from liquidation or bankruptcy.
Correct.
Right? You have to deal with the creditors, you have to deal with the employees, you have to deal with all the issues. You don't get to start from a clean slate. And so it's just much, much harder to do, just in general. Right?
But I'm glad you said the word sometimes, because that just signifies that this is one of the ways you could do something.
Yes.
There are many other ways that you could turn around a business. In our particular case, when we look at the businesses that Mutapa has, don't forget that some of them, the debts have been actually assumed by Treasury. So it's not necessarily that they had to go into liquidation. But secondly, there are certain idiosyncratic factors that us Zimbabweans have to fix before we can actually look for a foreign investor or another investor. We've got to deal with some of the governance issues in these businesses that come out of the fact that they were state-owned enterprises, right? So, and sometimes it takes a Zimbabwean to deal with that Zimbabwean problem, and then we can start to say, oh, you know what? Now we can start to talk to foreign investors. Because you try to bring somebody into that quagmire of problems, then they will probably give up at some point, which they have done. It's not like we have not tried to privatize businesses in the past. It's just that sometimes
we've tried.
I think we have. I think we have tried it. I think
tried to
I'll give you a good example of Zisco Steel.
Well, there's literally a handful. There's maybe Dairy Board,
correct,
and Kotco.
Correct.
Zisco, that experiment didn't turn out very well.
Exactly. So my point is, there are certain things that we've got to fix in order for us to be able to speak on an equal basis with an investor when they come to talk about your asset.
Yeah. So cool. If we then become Mutapa specific, and I'll give you kudos for the work you did at Kuvimba.
Thank you.
Some of those mines were failing, and you guys did a great job turning them around. Now, is it that kind of turnaround strategy and mindset? Is it scalable? So the thing about Kuvimba is that it's a mining house. All these businesses, even though the minerals involved are different, it's mining. It's the same sector. It's the same from a technical operational perspective. It's the same skills that you need. So you clean up the corporate governance at the top, and you make sure that you have a good operator, and you sort out the funding issues. You turn it around. Now, is this turnaround mindset scalable to so many different businesses, from telco to abattoirs to you've got so many different things. Is it scalable? Is this turnaround because turnaround involves, you mentioned governance, there's the operating aspect of it, and then there's the financial aspect,
and it's got to make business sense, right? It's got to be actually a business that can make money. Otherwise, you can't turn it around.
Absolutely.
As Warren Buffett often says, when there's a sinking ship, no matter how good a captain, the reputation of the ship almost always stays intact.
It's the captain who loses
his reputation because it will continue to sink. Right? Yeah.
So is it scalable? Can you scale a turnaround strategy in a diverse conglomerate?
I think, look, it's doable. Is it a lot of work? Yes. But do we have the capabilities to make that work? I think we do.
Yeah.
Because remember, we're a sovereign wealth fund. And I think by mandate, that means inclusivity in terms of advice from our local advisory partners within the Zimbabwean context. There's a lot of firms that have given advice to a number of these state-owned entities, or as we call them, portfolio companies or investees. And, there's some good ideas in there in terms of how these things should work. The principal shareholder of these entities in the past, in terms of the different line ministries, also have some very good ideas.
Yeah.
Right? It's a question of why weren't some of these things either implemented? Was it a funding issue in terms of access to capital?
Yeah.
Where everything's under the Ministry of Finance, so if you haven't serviced your debt, everything's commingled under that. I think we have to look at it in a sense of, it's a private-public partnership type of arrangement, where really we are saying it's not only private sector that can make this work, and it's not only public sector that can make this work. How do we find a convergence between the ideas coming from both voices? And we as the investment manager, if you like, in terms of the executive team, how do we sift all of that ideas, and how do we put the best one forward to the betterment of the country as a whole, and by default to its population, because that's what we're actually about. So I think, can we turn these entities around? I think time will tell. Is it a daunting task? Certainly. But I think, look, we've got natural resources that are world class. We've got entities that were set up with world class infrastructure. Does it need rehabilitation in a lot of cases? Yes. Do some of the entities need reimagination? Potentially. Are some of them just a funding issue? Yes. So you've got a number of, different sort of issues, and you're not going to find a blanket fix-all solution to all of them.
Not.
You have to do a proper diagnostic scan
Yeah.
on each and every one of them. And where we don't have the technical expertise, we will source in that expertise for a best recommendation.
Correct.
So I like that you referred to them as portfolio companies. So the sense that I get is that you don't think about it as managers of a conglomerate. You think about it as as investment managers managing a portfolio.
Yeah. So at the moment, it's your question is extremely key to people understanding Mutapa Investment Fund. We are not a super SOE. We have not taken state-owned enterprises to just simply become another bigger state-owned enterprise. You understand? The way the way the people of Zimbabwe should look at Mutapa Investment Fund is that in phases. Maybe for the next 3 to 5 years, we will be a very active shareholder, because we are trying to get our companies to restructure themselves for the betterment of our country, right? So as a shareholder, what does that mean? It means, number one, the corporate governance looks good. We are all happy with the corporate governance. Second thing is, as much as possible, we expect you to make a profit so that you can reduce your draw on the fiscus, right? Because in the past, because you're a state-owned enterprise, you know that no matter what happens, the government is going to come and bail you out. Now
So
you've got
is that where we are now? Because that's an interesting thing that for you to say.
Yeah.
Talk about, when these businesses were under the ministries,
Yeah.
they were just bleeding us dry. Right? Now they're in Mutapa.
Yes.
Is there now a clear demarcation that this is an independent legal entity, and if you guys fail, and
Yes.
I wish you success, but if you fail,
we want, but
Right.
yeah, go ahead.
and the whole thing is blowing up, is the state and us as taxpayers, are we on the hook? Or the framework through which it's been set up is that there's a clear line. This is now all these portfolio companies are now part of Mutapa, and if they blow up, I as a taxpayer am not on the hook.
No, you are on the hook purely because you're a shareholder, and if a company blows up, you are a shareholder. But there's limited liability
Yes,
now because it's
beautiful.
a private company.
Yes.
So it's a beautiful concept. But I think my point was simply the utopia for Mutapa Investment Fund is that none of our investee companies is a draw on the fiscus.
Okay.
None of them. This for me, that is success. If we fail to do that, then you can actually stand up and say you failed to do your job, because at the moment they are. Why? Because actually it is part of what government must do, right? That is its responsibility for all state-owned enterprises, right? I am not saying it's going to take 6 months. I'm not saying it will take it will take some time, but the ultimate goal is that these companies must be able to compete in the private sector. They must be able to make profits. They must be run properly in terms of good governance. And when we put all that together, they actually start to contribute towards a stabilization fund instead of them destabilizing our economy.
Absolutely. And let's not also forget our main sort of model in terms of we're a fund. So think of private equity.
Yeah.
The portfolio companies themselves are supposed to have the know-how and capability to formulate strategy and run operations.
Yeah.
We're there to look at the investment decisions after they have studied them and go, does this work? Are you looking at your capital allocation decisions right? Where should we source funding from? Because a lot of times, what you find with a number of CEOs is at times they're not good at both.
Yeah.
Operational decisions and investment decisions. So we pretty much saying, look, focus on operations. When it's an investment issue, a strategy issue, come to us. But when you need to first implement strategy, you need to synchronize the boards with our own strategy. And I think that's where it's a governance issue. In terms of what mandate does the fund have to dictate strategy and vision on its portfolio companies, and then have the boards dictate that onto its management.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's the management of Kuvimba
Of Mutapa.
that's there
Yeah.
to solely turn around these entities.
No.
It's not.
Yeah.
We still need execution capabilities in the portfolio companies themselves because we're a fund.
Yeah,
So it's a proper private equity type model.
I'm going to ask from the perspective of, an investment manager,
Yes.
right? In your portfolio,
Yes.
do you have sacred cows? Because somebody can make the argument that some of your portfolio companies ought to have been liquidated 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The state would have been better off because we poured so much good money after bad.
Yes.
All right, hemorrhaging the fiscus,
Yes.
right? So, for example, if you're sitting in a meeting and you're looking at your 3 telco assets, Tel1, Telesol, and Net1, and, it becomes clear from an objective analysis perspective that one of them is just a dog.
Yes. Correct.
It's irredeemable, right? Are you empowered to actually make that decision that, this particular one is so ugly, we just need to put it down?
Yeah.
I think they're all sacred cows.
They're all sacred cows.
Yeah, to firstly answer that question, they're all sacred
Well,
cows.
Ernest, I'm glad to say that we actually might disagree on this, so this is perfect. It shows the healthy debate that happens in Mutapa. So go for it.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense of, I think, let's look at why these entities have existed and why they've been brought into the
Into Mutapa,
Mutapa
yeah.
fold.
Yes,
Because
correct.
mind you, not all state-owned entities are under Mutapa at the moment.
But you guys have the
We've got the
Lions-
lion's
Not all,
share
right?
of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
There's still a few that we would like to have if
But
we had
I would
our way.
think within the line
you guys
ministry,
certainly don't lack for ambition.
yeah, within the line
No, we
ministries
don't.
themselves, they've looked at these entities and they've had a need for these entities to exist. Now, you can ask us the question of should some of them merge? Should some of them find a strategic partner? That's not an existential question
But-
in
but-
terms of
but
why
what-
they are there.
But what
So
about the
my
ones that
point,
ended up there by accident? Like Telesol was a private company; it was never owned by the state. And then we woke up one day, and some people in the state decided, let's adopt this.
Well, I mean, does the state legally have shares in Telesol?
Well, it's owned by Mutapa.
Well,
That's us, right?
Therefore, it's not there by accident. I that's what I wanted to say, because Mutapa is not just purely there to hold 100% owned assets. It is
Okay,
there
so-
to also own some assets in which the government has a minority or less than 100% shareholding. A good example is Wange Colliery, which actually we don't own the majority of Wange Colliery, right? The, CBZ is part of Mutapa, but the shares in CBZ are part of Mutapa that the state owns as opposed to all of CBZ, right? Because they are private shareholders. I think what is key from the question you have asked, which is why I say we may differ slightly in terms of how we are presenting it, though I think our thoughts are very much aligned. we value all of the entities that have been put under Mutapa because there is a responsibility that's been bestowed upon the managers of Mutapa to turn around those businesses and make them profitable. So we value them extremely high. Our value of them is extremely high.
So you're not taking them to sacred cow level from your perspective.
But there will be some entities within Mutapa, that are essential to the service provision that we need in our country. Energy, rail.
NRZ for sure.
You understand? And those assets, you might call them sacred cows. Why? Because even as a Zimbabwean, you would be very keen to see those entities working well, but also to not see them completely collapse or even completely be owned by, say, a foreign entity because of their importance in our nation. So, the way I look at it is, there are certain entities that are so important to our economy that we must find ways of making them work as Zimbabweans. However, there is nothing that says that just because you are an important entity in our nation, you can be an unprofitable entity. Those two things are not the same.
Okay.
They are not
100%,
the same.
I hear you.
And our job is to run these entities commercially, or at least demand that they run commercially in a manner that is profitable for the fund. Their sacred cowness, if I can call it that,
yes,
or their sacredness as a cow, depending on how you want to put it.
Yeah, sure.
Purely rests in the fact that they are important to our economy, but not sacred from a point that they must be run unprofitable.
Okay, fine. You know, when you talked about the importance of some of these entities and how it wouldn't be a great idea if they were owned by a foreigner, for example, because they're essential cog in our economy.
Or if they had foreign investment, maybe to be very clear.
Or dominated by or majority foreign owned.
Which could happen, yes.
And you know, when we're talking about Mutapa as a sovereign fund, so it's owned by us as Zimbabweans.
Absolutely.
So just to ask a philosophical question, which, you know, it's not necessarily peculiar to Mutapa, but just the idea of sovereign funds worldwide, right, is philosophically, right? So the structure of the Mutapa fund is the same as the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund and a bunch of other sovereign wealth funds.
Not quite, but
I mean,
I'll indulge you.
At a higher level.
Yeah. Probably Temasek more than Norwegian fund.
It's the state appoints the board and leadership and basically decides how it's going to be run at a high level, not on a day-to-day basis, but at a very high level. And in terms of the control of the business, in terms of the shareholding, or, you know, they're the ultimate trustee.
Yeah, from that perspective,
right?
I agree. Yes,
it's the state.
Yeah.
And there's a libertarian philosophical argument that I am in support of that says, actually, that's not the best structure. The sovereign wealth fund should be demutualized. Every citizen should have a proportionate share and have a share certificate.
Yes.
And we should decide the future of this fund.
Correct.
And how it's run.
Yes.
Right? Okay, that doesn't exist anywhere in the world.
Yes.
It's a libertarian idea.
Okay.
But it's an interesting philosophical perspective.
Not very. I don't
so
agree.
I
don't agree
with that. I'm not surprised that you don't agree.
I don't even think it's that interesting. I think that it is.
Why shouldn't I own it?
I think
outright?
it is
for my benefit. Why can't I own my proportionate stake?
We've already gone through a certain level of acceptance that the government exists to hold certain interests on our behalf. And we actually go to the polls.
Some of my personal balance sheet?
Yes, we already do that. You contribute to NASA, you contribute
discretionary
to
mandate
public
for a
pension
sovereign
funds.
wealth fund.
No.
With 20 million shareholders all being discretionary? So how does it work?
So let me put it.
I think that is a silly idea. I'm glad you called it philosophical, because thank you very much. It can be philosophical. You can spend all your days sitting on the corner of a beach somewhere thinking about it, but it is not a practical aspect. The fact of the matter is the people of Zimbabwe elect their government to look after certain interests. And in this particular case, Mutapa is one of the interests that the people of Zimbabwe elect their government to look after.
No.
End of story. Why should we then give you a single share each so that you can prove that they are looking after your interests?
So, okay. The reason why I have this perspective is because if you look at the world, if you look at public markets, right, and the efficiency of the leadership of companies in the private sector, this is things run by governments, and it's not Zimbabwe. It's not peculiar to Zimbabwe. This is everywhere in the world. Right? The private sector is just more efficient. It just does things better. It just
is
gets
Saudi Aramco
better.
owned by government or not?
Should it be?
No, that's
owned
not the
by
question.
government.
I'm answering your question in terms of, is it run better? Is it one of the best run companies in the world, yes or no?
I don't know whether it's one of the best run companies, but do you know where the name Saudi, where Aramco comes from?
No, that's not the question.
It was initially...
That's not the question. The question was, is Saudi Aramco one of the
well
best
run? It's one of the biggest oil companies in the world.
Thank
but
you.
It was founded as a private company.
No. End of question.
Yeah.
Who owns it?
It's the state of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you.
But would there be better
No.
options?
Let's not go anywhere else. I think that's you've just answered the question.
These guys are trying to bully me on my own show.
No. It's not that. I think that when you bring arguments, please bring them in a much better philosophical way.
But anyway, we'll move on. I just thought it was interesting to explore.
No, I accept the point, but what you are trying to do is, I'm a mathematician. We used to laugh at people to say, look, when you got the answer right, you then continued to write the answer after you had got it correct, right? Now, we already have an answer for how every citizen can own an asset. It is the government. Why should we try and continue to write that solution in a different way?
The other thing I always
That's the nature of innovation.
No, this is not innovative. It's backwardness.
Yeah. I mean, the other way I always look at public-private sort of arrangement is recognizing in any market, government is the biggest ticket in town. Whichever way they choose to identify themselves within that ecosystem of the GDP, they're still the biggest ticket in town. So whether you want to say they own entities or they don't, the realization is by default, right?
Yep.
If government is just taxing you, right, they are your biggest shareholder, right?
For sure.
De facto,
100%.
right? So when we call a state-owned enterprise state-owned, is it actually a worse-off deal for government? Is it a better deal? But when you sum it all up, in any economy, government is the biggest ticket in town.
Yeah,
So once we realize that, even as private sector, you always realize whatever you're doing, whether it's legislative, whether you want to run into a new industry, has to fit in with government agenda because they
100%.
have the social contract. Now, how do you implement long-term government vision? Because at the end of the day, if you're a capitalist, you're looking at just impact and returns, whether it's over your lifetime, over a certain period.
For sure,
How
for sure.
do you fit that to be intergenerational? We've got gold, we've got platinum. These are finite resources. How do you plug that in, that when we're not longer alive, the economy is diversified and the benefit still accrues to the next generation? Otherwise, we're stealing off our next generation. If you leave that only to private sector, and Rufaro's ambition is to go buy a big yacht, what's happening to the next generation? So I think it's a fine balancing equation when you look at a sovereign wealth fund and you look at its portfolio. in terms of what are you actually trying to do. And the reason I brought up something like Saudi is all of a sudden you saw MBS starting to go, okay, this whole green transition, what does it mean for Saudi Arabia? Right? Because if we left with these resources, Venezuela's sitting on the world's largest oil resources. They might miss out on the boat of not having exploited that resource. No, I'm being kind. I'm not a politician, right? So you then go, how do you balance it out in terms of there's a nation, right, bestowed with resources, whether it's carbon credits, because no one owns the atmosphere, right, whether it's water, whether it's minerals. How do you create a spectrum to involve generations, right, to participate along the volatility of all of these commodity prices? It might be high today, it might be low, it might be lower in 50 years, it might be high, and we might never ever know. But there's also the strategy side around what are nations competing with against each other, which you and I as a capitalist might not be able to decipher. China's got a long-term strategy around its minerals. If we sell all our platinum and all our copper in our neighboring countries, at the point we want to industrialize, it might be 20 times more expensive. So should we be looking at some of these assets and going, let's not extract all of them, but actually control the pricing around some of these commodities as Africa? That's where it's bilateral government type discussions and private players won't be able to influence it.
Yeah.
So I think you have to look at the Sovereign Wealth Fund in that context.
No, I agree with you.
And understand its need outside of what is this portfolio company there for? Should it be sold to a private player because they can run it better? There has to be an overlay of a nationalistic strategy around what you want to achieve as a nation. Then you get granular into the implementation around that strategy to the portfolio companies.
I like that. I
You guys are clearly not libertarians.
No, I like that because I think what's quite key. You said something that was really key, and it sparked my mind. What country is the world's biggest oil producer?
The United States of America.
Right, but we all think that they are out there fighting wars for oil, right? Because they have already realized that as much as they have the resource to continue to be the world's largest producer, they need to preserve them for future generations. And they need to therefore add things from elsewhere. And that's, I just thought that was quite key to mention, because you mentioned, Ernest mentioned about the fact that at some point we may have no platinum, no chrome, no gold, no copper, but at the same time we will still need those resources. So maybe we need to also start thinking about how we can preserve our resources for the fact that someday we will be technologically more advanced and we'll need them than now to just purely think, let's sell off everything we have because the prices are good. And that's partly what Mutapa needs to be thinking about for the people of Zimbabwe.
So, if I hear you guys correctly, and please correct me if I get you wrong, there is a ambition and agenda driving the vision behind Mutapa.
Yes.
That's not just about alpha, about getting the highest possible investment return.
No, there isn't, and partly because of our mandate. Our mandate is not purely to turn around struggling state-owned enterprises. Our mandate includes a future generation. So that means the decisions we make today are expected to have an impact in the future, even beyond our current generation. We may not even be alive to realize some of the benefits. But when they wake up and they see what Zimbabwe is, they ought to think that this generation thought about them and thought about using its current wealth for the benefit of the future. That's what a sovereign wealth fund is.
Well, we're going to continue this debate. Unfortunately, my producer is jumping up and down.
As he always does.
And he wants
Is he a Mrewa? Are you a Soko? He jumps up and down all the time.
He's a Chiwa. So, guys, thank you so much for coming on. And I think, look, one of the things I love about doing this show and interacting with people like Simba and Ernst is that we have very strong disagreements, we butt heads, and but that's what I love about our conversations, right? They're civil and they're thought-provoking, and we don't agree on a lot of things, and that's perfectly okay.
Good, 100%.
And I think that if people had more conversations like this, we would all be richer, intellectually. Anyway, so thank you so much, guys. And as a beneficiary, along with my kids and their kids, to the Mutapa Fund, I really hope that you enjoy great success in your endeavors, and to the extent that you need a sounding board who's not going to be politically correct, who's just going to call a spade a spade. I think you will always find that in me. So thanks a lot, Ernst and Simba. And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed this as much as we did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cheers,
Thank
my
you.
guy.
Cheers.
Cheers. I have an empty glass, but cheers nonetheless.